Resistance is that force, that internal force that's a voice in our head or whatever it is that stops us from doing the things that we know we should do, right? If there's any kind of secret to life, at least on a professional level or a calling level, it's if you can learn to overcome your internal resistance, nothing can stop you. But if you can't, you're dead in the water. So it's procrastination, it's a susceptibility to distraction, it's arrogance, it's perfectionism, it's all those kind of things that stand between us. Like I said, the unlived life within us is that calling, that dream, the book we want to write, the movie we want to make, the podcast we want to do. And what stops us from doing it is this voice in our head that tells us we're not good enough, etc., etc. So that's resistance with a capital R.
Hello and welcome to Tuesdays with Morrisey, where we share insights from great thinkers. Today I'm excited to be joined by Daily Pressfield, author of The War of Art, which has sold millions of copies worldwide, as well as many other books, including Gates of Fire, The Legend of Bagger Vance, and most recently, The Daily Pressfield. Steve, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Adam. It's great to be on Tuesdays with Morrisey.
It's an honor to have you.
Even though today is Thursday.
Well, it'll release on a Tuesday.
We won't tell anybody that.
It's our secret. I want to start our conversation with The Daily Pressfield. It's a book that I'm currently working through. What was your inspiration behind this book?
It came from a fellow Texan of yours, Ryan Holiday, who, has written the Daily Stoic, a 365-day book that you read through the year. And we were talking one time and he said, you, Steve, you have so much content. You should do a book like this. And as I started to think about it, I thought, this is actually a great way to get my message about overcoming your own internal resistance and procrastination, self-sabotage, all that sort of stuff as a writer or an artist. Because a 365-day sort of devotional type of, where you read something each day, I, as a kind of a mentor, can kind of walk the reader through a project, and the first day to me is like the first day of when you're sitting down to work, and then just take it to 365 days. So it just seemed like a really good way to consolidate a lot of the stuff I've been trying to put out there into the world into one, working package that could help somebody from start of a project to the finish.
Can I tell you a story about when I met Ryan Holiday?
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
So I live in Austin also. I was getting dropped off by an Uber driver at the Austin airport. And I get out of the car, and sitting outside on this like kind of circular cinder block is Ryan Holiday. And before I knew what I would say to him, I was already talking to him. So like this kind of came out like, "Hey Ryan, how's it going?" And I was like, didn't know really what to say. So I was like, all right, what are you most excited about? Where are you headed? And he's like, well, my flight's not for 3 hours. And I'm going out to California for a book tour. And in my head, I was like, what is this guy doing at the airport 3 hours ahead of time? And I was like, great. Like, are you excited for the book tour? And he's like, honestly, man, I just can't wait to go home. and we didn't really get into it, but I was thinking to myself, it doesn't sound that stoic, but I really appreciate the
honesty. Yeah. I must say, Ryan has been very helpful to me. Like when I was first starting to get into social media, I called him up and I said, I don't know anything about this. Could you kind of tutor me? And he said, yeah, come back to Austin and we'll spend a day, and we did. And he really sort of, gave me a lot of, things I never would have thought about that sort of got my head into it, because as a writer, any kind of creative person these days, you got to be on social media one way or another because nobody else is going to put anything out there for you.
Yeah, I mean, he's such an inspiration and a master marketer. I mean, he was one of his first books with Growth Hacker Marketing, which is, a staple of my marketer toolkit. And then just similar to you, has a tremendous drive. Like he's got a drive to create that seems almost insatiable.
Yeah. Yeah, he definitely does. And I think he's got the rest of his life pretty together too, the
Hmm.
family, the ranch, the kids, his wife, the bookstore. He's got, all kinds of stuff going.
Yeah, he said something pretty interesting once. I read he was saying you can have uh, work, family, or scene. You can have two of three, and he's
Uh-huh.
definitely chosen his craft and his family, which I
Uh-huh.
think is super cool. A big theme of your work, you mentioned it earlier, is resistance. That was the basis of the War of Art. And in the gift box for the Daily Pressfield, there's a quote from the War of Art on it. It's on a magnet that says, "Most of us live two lives, the life we live and the unlived life within us. And between the two is resistance." For listeners that might not be familiar with that concept, what is resistance and why is it so important to you?
Resistance is, in my definition, with a capital R. It's maybe the shortest way to explain it is if you've ever bought a treadmill and took it home to your house and you wind up gathering dust in the attic, then you know what resistance is. Resistance is that force, that internal force that's a voice in our head or whatever it is that stops us from doing the things that we know we should do, right? If there's any kind of secret to life, at least on a professional level or a calling level, it's if you can learn to overcome your internal resistance, nothing can stop you. But if you can't, you're dead in the water. So it's procrastination, it's a susceptibility to distraction, it's arrogance, it's perfectionism, it's all those kind of things that stand between us. Like I said, the unlived life within us is that calling, that dream, the book we want to write, the movie we want to make, the podcast we want to do. And what stops us from doing it is this voice in our head that tells us we're not good enough, et cetera, et cetera. So that's resistance with a capital R.
When I hear you talk about resistance, I'm reminded of a story that Daniel Pink told me on this podcast. I was talking about David Brooks's New York Times columnist writing process, and
Uh-huh.
he described in his book The Second Mountain, his writing process is literally crawling on hands and knees, looking at out of context post-it notes. And Daniel Pink's like, yeah, my writing process is like crawling on my hands and knees, looking at out of context post-it notes while wearing a necklace of steak, and a tiger is clawing at me during the entire time. Do you find like so? I want to contrast resistance with the idea of genius, zones of genius from Gay Hendricks or flow. Do you find resistance is your writing process all like getting attacked by a tiger, or is it really like the first bit when you get started and in the process of getting into a flow state?
To me, resistance happens more before I've sat down. Once I'm sitting down, then it becomes like like being at the gym,
Hmm.
where you have to sort of work your way into it a little bit, but you get into it pretty fast, and then that thing that I call resistance doesn't is gone. Now you're just doing your work,
Yeah.
and you may have obstacles. It may be hard, but and hopefully you do get into a kind of you know, a flow state maybe is a little too romantic, but you get into, a rhythm of doing your work and, um, and time goes away and you wake up and you're done.
By many accounts, you were a late bloomer. You write about that you spent years working various jobs from fruit picker to truck driver to cab driver to teaching or many other jobs before getting Bagger Vance published at age 52. What was your own journey with resistance like?
For the first time, I quit a job when I was 22 as a advertising copywriter in New York to write a book. And I spent the next 2 years trying to write something. And when I got to the end, my own resistance defeated me. And I kind of blew up the book and blew up my life by doing various things, my marriage, et cetera, et cetera. And then I spent like about 5 years kind of running away from writing, um, and seeing it as this terrible mistake that I made. I should never have even tried to do it. And then at some point, after that, I did get back into trying to do it. And at that point, it did become a pure battle with resistance of just learning to become a professional, learning to sit down each day and do it. And it just took me years and years to get there. I had about a 10-year career as a screenwriter that where I was actually working and making money, but I was just learning the craft and learning what a story was until finally writing The Legend of Bagger Vance was the first book I got published. And since then, knock wood, everything's been plain sailing, more or less.
Are you familiar with the concept of shadow careers?
Oh yeah,
Yeah, so
I
like
invented that concept, I think.
you lived it for a while, like that example of giving, like, we might have a dream, and we might, our subconscious wants to keep us safe, so we might end up close to it but not doing it. So you gave the example of copywriter but not book writer, or like another one, maybe it's like you want to write a book but you become a literary agent,
Yeah,
etc.
yeah,
How did
yeah.
you get awareness around like that, what you were experiencing was resistance?
Um, It's a really, I don't know. I really don't know, Adam. There wasn't like any moment when I suddenly said, "Oh, wow." It was this force, that I always say that just radiates off of this thing,
Oh yeah.
and I was always, always aware of it. And, but I thought it was only me that suffered from that. And so I just started to think about it more and more and sort of formulating various ways of attacking it or ways of thinking about it. And finally, it did become clear in my mind that this was the thing that was kicking my ass. And I better learn how to get around it one way or another, or I was going down the toilet big time.
Yeah. You mentioned during your screenwriting days learning the craft. How did this journey for the decades leading up to your first book publish shape your view on the concept of falling in love with the process?
Ah, um, I think I always was in love with the process. It just was that I couldn't do it well enough. Um, uh, yeah, I mean, it always was. Once I finally really did learn to sit down at the keyboard and work,
Mhm.
it became the activity that allowed me to be sane, that allowed me to go to sleep at the end of the day, instead of being driven crazy by the voice in my head. I really felt that, and nothing else worked. No other kind of job. Love didn't work. Drugs didn't work. Excitement didn't work. Drama in my life didn't work. Only this one thing of sitting down and trying to, write a story is the only thing that kind of gave me sanity. So if that is being in love with the process, I don't know if that's what it is, but I always had that. I just wasn't good enough to do it at a level that was worthy of publication.
Yeah. When I hear you talk about resistance and getting aware of resistance, I think about intuition. And I'm curious, like, one of the things I think is hardest is discerning between resistance that might come up when you're in pursuit of your potential, and resistance that might come up when you feel like your intuition might be warning you that you're not on the right path. How do you think
Yeah,
about those two?
that's a really great question, a really tricky one. I mean, for me, I have my own sort of mantra that I say there, or principle, which is when in doubt, it's resistance. On the other hand, like a few weeks ago, for the first time, I taught a course. I did like a 1 day seminar, and it was really hard for me, and I really didn't want to do it. I'm not really a speaker, and it went over really well. People loved it. So I'm asking myself, is my negative feeling about this resistance, or is it just something I really shouldn't be doing? And it's very hard to tell. In this case, I think it's something I shouldn't be doing, but it's very hard to tell.
How in this case did you figure out, or like kind of leaning towards isn't it maybe not isn't the right thing?
The bottom line for me is I'm a writer. I'm a guy that wants to be alone in a room doing a thing, you know. Now I may have to from time to time get out in the world and promote stuff,
Hmm.
you know. But my calling really, you know, people respond to the War of Art and they say, "Oh, this is a great teaching. There's so much great stuff in this. You should be teaching this," you know, and because people need it, you know, and they respond to it. But and I've sort of thought, well, maybe there's validity to that. But I say, well, they can read the book. I don't have to actually go out there and verbally, you know, perform it. So that's, you know,
Yeah.
sitting down in front of this keyboard is where I really feel like this is my calling. This is what I'm trying to do.
Yeah. Seth Godin, I think, said War of Art was one book that you should read 10 times. And now
I
you have
hope so.
the David.
Even I read it over
Well,
and
yeah,
over.
yeah. It's like I often think like, hey, should you read 100 books, or should you read one book 100 times? And the older I
Mm.
get, the more I think is you should spend more time with the things that really resonate. Can you speak a little bit about? I mean, you've been so consistent these last few years. Like you maybe have released one or more books a year for the last few years, it seems, and you're consistent with the weekly writing Wednesday newsletter. What's behind your continued drive to create?
Like I say, it's the only thing that makes me feel good.
Hmm.
And I have a lot of ideas these days. And also, like as you said before, I was 52 years old before I got my first book published. So I sort of felt like ever since then, I'm kind of way behind the time. You know, I've wasted a lot of time. It wasn't really a waste of time, but it was a lot of years where certainly nothing ever saw the light of day that I worked on. So I do feel like I've got to make up some time.
Yeah.
And actually, I've got a bunch of, you know, a few books sitting around that are already done, just waiting, you know, to come out. So I don't know. I'm really glad that it's happening.
One of the things I think's hard. I mean, you hear it all the time. Ideas are easy. Execution is hard. When you're visioning projects, how do you determine which ones to commit to? And like
That's another great
and
question.
also like in prioritization too, because like sometimes you'll get so many ideas, at least for me, sometimes I'll have so many ideas that I can't figure out the prioritization. I might not do any of them.
Uh-huh.
Resistance.
Yeah, it is like that is a form of resistance, having too many ideas.
Mhm.
That negative force of resistance is trying to stop us from doing our thing. So it goes, oh, here's 12 ideas. And you know, that over choice or over whatever they call it. But for me, the way I decide if an idea is something that I want to commit to is I ask myself, how afraid are you
Mhm.
of doing this? And the answer that I want to get is scared shitless. You know, that you should be terrified of whatever it is. And I'll say another thing here that I think I have found is really true. Um, for the first 9 months or so of a book that I'm working on, I am racked with self doubt all the way through. It doesn't go away until I've got it almost done. And it's to the point where I feel like if I'm not feeling that self doubt, something's wrong. In other words, I should be feeling that self doubt. And a big part of, I think, the skill of being a professional writer or any kind of creative person is to keep going despite the voices in your head that say, this is a stupid idea, you know, nobody's going to be interested in it and you can't do it, you're a you know, all that sort of stuff. So so operating in the face of self-doubt is a very big virtue and skill for anybody in a creative field.
I want to talk a little bit about inspiration as a byproduct of the work, which I think is a little bit countercultural and an outcome oriented society. And also the concept of the artist journey. You said the artist discovers herself by the work she produces. Who are you? Dance and find out, sing and find out, write and find out. Can you talk a little bit about inspiration and self discovery as a byproduct of doing the work?
Yes. I mean,
Many books worth.
you know, young people and myself when I was young, you're always asking yourself, do I have a calling? Well, do I have a passion? Who am I? You know, what, you know, I like playing soccer. I like, you know, whatever. Um, And I'm convinced after many, many years that we don't have a clue who we are answering that question. Who am I? There's somehow the conscious mind can't come up with that. But definitely a believer that once you start into your calling, whatever that may be, writing, dancing, podcasting, starting companies, you'll find out who you are by what you produce, by the works you produce. Like I can say of any book I've written or anything before that, before I did it, I had no idea that I would ever write something like that. It wasn't like I was passionately, you know, and one idea for me succeeds another uh, in almost a chaotic way. It's not like a progression, um, but as each one, once it's out there in the world and on the page, you look at it and you go, "Oh wow, I had no idea that was me." But now that I look at it, I realize it is me. So I think a writer, like you were saying, Adam, a writer or an artist doesn't write to express themselves. They write to discover themselves, or they dance to discover themselves, or sing to discover themselves.
Yeah, you wrote in the War of Art, our job in this life is not to shape ourselves into some ideal we imagine we ought to be, but to find out who we already are and become it. When,
Which
yeah, go ahead.
I absolutely believe that. Yes.
Yeah, one of my mentors is a fairly well known rabbi up in Dallas. He's got probably one of the best YouTube videos that not enough people have seen. A guy named Rabbi David Stern. His video is called Round Trip Spirituality. And
Uh-huh.
in a session with him once, he kind of helped me see that the answers are realized on the other side of action. And it's
I
very
like that.
much
That's really great.
it's very much in line with Letters to a Young Poet, Roca, when he says, "Live the questions."
Hmm.
If you have a question, you go live it out, and you'll get the answers. And it might
Yeah,
not happen overnight. It might be decades in the making.
yeah. That's great. I love that. It's like I've also heard a slightly different version of that. I know you have too. That the answer is on the other side of fear.
Mm.
Because you are always afraid to take that action into the unknown, right? And and again, by living it out, you find out who you really are and what's really important to you.
Can you speak a little bit about the concept of the understory and why it's so important?
Ah, well, this is a real writing question. Um, it's like in any work of fiction, any story that you're going to do, there's a kind of a surface story that's sort of the plot of the story, like the detective, it's a murder and he's got to find out blah, 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 right? That's the overstory. That's the top story. But underneath it is kind of what the story is really all about. And I actually will write that whole thing out in a like a file that I will never show to anybody, only to myself, about what it's really all about. What choices the protagonist really having to make, and it's never what the surface story thinks it is, right?
Mhm.
So I would always say anybody, if you're writing a story now, if you're working on a on a narrative of some kind, ask yourself what's the plot, and then what's the story underneath that plot. It's really interesting and of course you can apply it to your own life too. I'm working this job, I'm married to this woman, I have these, but what's really going on underneath the surface?
Yeah, I think it's much bigger than a writing story. It's kind of like the hero's journey applies to all of our lives, and we're living our own hero's journey. A funny example: a friend of mine runs a pool management company in Ohio. They staff lifeguards and whatever. So I was asking
Ah,
him. He was trying to come up with some tagline for a newsletter, and he asked me about it. And he was like, "We staff pools," and I'm like, "No, no, no. You don't staff pools. You're preserving the American summer." For a lot of
ah,
Americans, that's really the understory of what they're doing.
ah,
It's a real compelling why that's much
that's
bigger than
great. Yeah.
staffing pool. It's like the bricklayer parable with
What's that? I haven't heard that.
oh. So this guy walks up to these bricklayers, and one of them says, I'm laying bricks to feed my family," and another one might have said, I'm paraphrasing, like, "I'm building a wall." I'm just building a wall, and after I'm done building the wall, I'll go home. And then he goes up to the third bricklayer and says, "What are you doing?" He's like, "I'm building a cathedral, a devotion to the Almighty."
Ah, oh, that's great. Oh,
Yeah,
that's great. Ah,
yeah.
yeah.
They were laying
Ah,
bricks, but they all had very
yeah.
different relationships to the work. I mean, one of the things I've been thinking about and fascinated about is how motivators change over time. And what I mean by that is, like, when we're younger, we might be motivated by a couple things. So maybe it's status. I know it could be also anxiety, fear, and shame can be a real driver. And then as we grow, heal, learn, etc., new drivers might emerge. Maybe creative expression or service or impact, etc. What I think is really interesting is there's a gap in between where, like, I'm curious if you've seen this, where your old drivers aren't driving you anymore, but the new ones haven't, and it can actually
Ah,
feel quite depressing. Like, or if you stop drinking coffee and you have caffeine withdrawal, it's like your energy levels haven't bounced back up. But what I think is so interesting, and it's related to the understory, is when these new motivators emerge, you either make changes. So maybe it's you do the work, or you change your relationship to the things you're already doing. So maybe you
ah,
shift from laying bricks to building cathedrals.
yeah. Ah, that's great, Adam. And I think the bottom line is we're all building a cathedral. We might not at the first, like you say, the first brick, we're doing it to feed the family, or we could do it, but it's sooner or later, we do realize that we are building a cathedral, and it's our hero's journey, it's our artist's journey, it's our calling. And again, like you say, it's the understory, it's what we were put here for.
Yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of people, the war of art sits next in their library to the artist journey by Julia Cameron. Have you heard that before?
Uh-huh.
Do people say that?
Yes. Uh-huh.
Yeah, and it's like,
The
for
Artist's
her,
Way is actually her
the
book.
artist way, excuse me. Yeah, and her thing is, like, basically, and you've talked about this too. Like, your job is basically to get out of the way and let the story that needs to be told be a channel for the story that needs to be told.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
I thought it was pretty funny. This fall, Lawrence of Arabia was re-released in theaters. I know it's a movie that you've considered to be one of the greatest of all time. Why is it such a movie that resonates with you?
Ah, it's it's almost the perfect movie in my opinion. Um, First of all, it has incredible scale. You know, um, the desert. It hardly could get any bigger than that, unless it was 2001: A Space Odyssey, something like that. Um, it has grandeur. It has scale. The theme is, is definitely worthy of something biblical. Even the characters are great. The action is great. The Robert Bolt, the screenwriter, the screenplay is like a classic. It's like the Iliad, and David Lean directed it incredibly. And it's just everything else kind of. It's like Lawrence of Arabia is like Mount Everest. What are you going to compare it to? There are very very few movies that are that big and are that beautifully realized.
Yeah, it's funny. It's like the greatest movie of all time, despite being 4 hours long in the desert with no romance at all. You know,
Yeah.
just for me, what really stands out and moves me about it is they capture a man wrestling with his own destiny like no other
Yeah.
movie I've seen.
Yeah.
You had a
So true.
guy
It's
who
like,
didn't sign up for this. He just happened to be the subject matter expert at the right place at the right time, thrust into something really, really big, the making of the modern Middle East.
now, if you think about that in terms of understory,
Mhm.
in the character of Lawrence, right on the surface, he's this kind of minor lieutenant, you know, uh, unknown dude. But his personal understory is he's like Alexander the Great
Mhm.
in terms of charisma, vision, ability to lead people, to create a movement. And the story really is about the upper story guy, the regular guy, wrestling with this this daemon that's in him. Who am I? And the story and the screenplay, Robert Bolt's screenplay, really gets to that. There are a bunch of scenes, as you know, where he's wrestling with, am I I know I'm not ordinary, I'm extraordinary. And of course, the real Lawrence, I mean, do you know what the real story of after he got out and finished his Arabia part?
I really don't know it that well. I've read the book, but I can't claim to know the real story.
I mean, the real story was he came back to England, changed his name, became T.E. Shaw instead of T.E. Lawrence, joined the Royal Air Force as an enlisted man. And in other words, he was just trying to become an ordinary person. The daemon, his extraordinary self, was something he just couldn't live with. And and then he basically, whether he literally killed himself or just accidentally killed
Yeah.
himself, he just couldn't live with this thing inside him, and he had to kill his physical body to stop that torment.
Wow, I had no idea he re-enlisted just to try to be ordinary.
Yeah.
What advice would you give? When we're talking about resistance and battling, it's very applicable to writing, but it's much bigger. You mentioned it's the company you want to start, the life you want to build, whatever. What advice do you give to listeners, regardless of what they want to do with their lives?
I think simply, like the quote that you read before, that most of us live two lives, the life we live and the unlived life within us, the understory, right? The cathedral, what we were really put here to do. And our job in this life really is to find out what that understory is, what that calling is. And the only thing I would say to anybody is that when you find that, or on the way to do it, it's not going to be a straight, easy road.
Mm.
It's going to be really, really this force of resistance with a capital R, this dragon that guards the gold. The gold, you may find the gold, you might be able to see it right out there, but there's going to be a dragon that stands between you and that gold, no matter what it is, so that before you can get to that gold of your calling, your role in life, you have to fight a war, the war of art, and and you better be ready for it because nobody's going to give you that gold.
Yeah. It was this past weekend. I was up in Ohio, where I'm from originally. I was visiting some friends. One of my friends has a couple kids. They were watching the movie Coco on repeat, which was I got to see probably an hour of it 6 times because they like to skip a certain part. But when you're talking about the gold, Joseph Campbell said, the gold you seek is in the back of the cave. And I thought it was amazing what Pixar did in this Coco movie, where you got this kid looking for his grandfather, and he's in a cave, and he gives up, and his real grandfather emerges. So I think it's amazing, not only like the understories, but also the elements of the hero's journey and surrender that can cause us to, commit to our path or get the gold or
Uh-huh.
anything like that.
So there are good things in Ohio.
Yeah,
That's the
I
lesson.
guess you can watch Coco 6 times. I thought it was funny. One of your books is called "Put Your Ass Where Your Heart Wants to Be," which I just think is a great lesson. It's like, hey, if you want to be on Broadway, be in New York City. Probably one of your favorite lines you've ever written, in my opinion, was you said, "The Dalai Lama doesn't live in Terre Haute." um,
But again, doing an understory on a kind of a deeper level, put your ass where your heart wants to be means commit
mhm.
to where your heart wants to be. You don't actually have to move
Yeah.
to whatever, like Stephen King, wherever he lives in Maine, or I guess he has a house in Florida too. He sort of brings his own personal, wherever he is where he ought to be because
Mhm.
he's so committed to what he's doing.
You mentioned you have a list of projects, some that are going to be released, some that you're already working on. I know you can't share too much about those, but can you share a little bit about whether they're novels versus nonfiction?
There's two new books that are sort of like follow-ups to the War of Art.
Cool.
Um, that I'm just sort of waiting. They're done. It's just a matter of um, finding the right time and the right way to kind of release them. And then the one I'm working on now that you asked me earlier before we started today, what I'm excited about is a novel that's set in World War II. Um, uh, that's the one that my heart is most into.
Very fun. Well, Steve, you've been an inspiration to so many and really gracious with your time today. What's the best way for listeners to keep up in the work you do?
Ah, um, I have a website that's just my name. It's got all sorts of stuff there, and I do, as you mentioned before, I have a once a week a what I call Writing Wednesdays on this website. Um, and if you subscribe to it, each week I do like the equivalent of like another chapter of the War of Art,
Hmm.
talking about the creative process and so on and so forth. And then I'm on Instagram just under my name, Stephen with a V Pressfield, and I'm doing videos all the time there.
Awesome. We'll have links to your website and your Instagram in the show notes. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Hey, thanks, Adam. It's great to do this. People don't know we did this once before, and it didn't.
Years and years in the making.
My
It's
computer screwed it up. So anyway, I'm glad we got
nonsense.
to do it again, and we'll do it again some other time too. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you too. Thanks, Steve. Thank you for listening to Tuesdays with Morrisey. That conversation was with the great writer Stephen Pressfield, author of War of Art, Gates of Fire, Legend of Bagger Vance, the Daily Pressfield, and many more. What I enjoyed about the episode was Stephen's lessons about how we can battle resistance to pursue our potential in our lives. If you enjoyed the show, share it with a friend, and we'll see you here soon. Thanks.